On the 30th of January 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci stood in the suffocating Philippine heat, sweat trailing down his temple as he stared at the intelligence report that would define his legacy. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the weight of what it demanded. 600 Allied prisoners of war were dying behind the barbed wire of Cabanatuan prison camp, and the Japanese had issued a chilling directive: eliminate all POWs before American forces could liberate them. The clock had started ticking, and Mucci knew that conventional tactics would result in a massacre. What he needed was something the enemy would never expect: a force so small, so audacious, that the Japanese would underestimate them until it was far too late. The 6th Ranger Battalion had earned its reputation through blood and precision in the mountains of New Guinea, but nothing had prepared them for this mission. Intelligence reports indicated that between 300 to 800 Japanese soldiers occupied positions around the camp, with another 1,000 reinforcements stationed just miles away in Cabanatuan City. Captain Robert Prince, Mucci's operations officer, had spent 3 sleepless nights studying reconnaissance photographs, calculating angles of fire, timing patrol rotations, and measuring the exact distance from the tree line to the prison fence. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives and detailed in Hamptonside's comprehensive account, Ghost Soldiers, the Rangers would have to cross an open field with zero cover, a killing zone that military tacticians would classify as suicide territory. The plan violated every principle taught at Fort Benning. 121 Rangers would deliberately position themselves to be surrounded by superior forces, using the prison camp itself as the center of a deadly geometric trap. While the Japanese expected attacks to come from overwhelming American strength, Mucci would do the opposite. His men would infiltrate, strike with surgical precision, and turn the enemy's numerical advantage into a fatal weakness. The key lay in synchronization so perfect that even a 5-second delay could collapse the entire operation into catastrophic failure. Captain Juan Pajota of the Filipino guerrillas listened intently as Mucci outlined the American role. Pajota commanded approximately 250 battle-hardened fighters who knew every trail, every river crossing, every Japanese checkpoint in the region. Without Pajota's men, the mission was impossible. The guerrillas would establish a blocking position at the Cabu Bridge, the only route for Japanese reinforcements from Cabanatuan City. They would have to hold against potentially 1,000 enemy soldiers for at least 30 minutes while the Rangers executed the raid. Pajota looked at the American colonel and nodded slowly. He had been fighting the Japanese occupation since 1941, had watched his countrymen tortured and executed, had buried friends and family. This was the moment he had been preparing for. As darkness fell on the 29th of January, the combined force moved out. 121 Rangers, 250 Filipino guerrillas, and a handful of Alamo scouts, who would serve as guides, began their 30-mile infiltration through enemy-controlled territory. They moved in absolute silence, communicating through hand signals, avoiding roads and villages where collaborators might alert Japanese patrols. Every man carried only essential equipment: ammunition, grenades, medical supplies, and the psychological burden of knowing that 600 lives depended on their success. The 29th of January stretched into an agonizing test of endurance as the Rangers pressed deeper into enemy territory. Staff Sergeant Norton Most led his squad through a sugarcane field where the stalks grew so dense that visibility dropped to mere feet, every rustling leaf potentially masking a Japanese sentry. The men moved in a rhythm perfected through months of jungle warfare. 3 steps, pause, listen, 3 more steps. Behind them, Medic James Fisher mentally reviewed the triage protocols he would need when the shooting started, knowing that in the chaos of combat, he would have to make impossible decisions about who received treatment first. Lieutenant William O'Connell's platoon reached the designated assembly area roughly a mile from Cabanatuan just after midnight. Through his field glasses, he could see the faint glow of the guard towers, electric lights powered by a generator that hummed like a distant swarm of insects. The prison camp sprawled across approximately 60 acres, surrounded by 8-foot-high fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers anchored each corner, manned by sentries with searchlights and machine guns. Between the American position and those fences lay 600 yards of open rice paddies, flat as a table, offering concealment equivalent to a billiard table. Military doctrine suggested that attacking across such terrain required at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage and heavy artillery support. The Rangers had neither. This content draws upon historical documentation from the United States Army Center of Military History and veteran testimonies compiled in the years following World War II. Captain Prince crawled forward to conduct his final reconnaissance, his body pressed so flat against the earth that blades of grass brushed his face. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he counted the guard rotations, noted the machine gun emplacements, identified the weakest points in the defensive perimeter. The Japanese had positioned their forces expecting an attack from the main road, where American armor and infantry would logically approach. They had not considered that attackers might come from the side, where the fields offered no cover, but where their defensive attention was weakest. This oversight would prove fatal. As the 30th of January dawned, the Rangers faced an unexpected complication. A Japanese convoy rumbled past their position, so close that the men could smell the exhaust from the trucks and hear the soldiers laughing inside. Lieutenant Colonel Mucci made an agonizing decision: postpone the raid by 24 hours. The risk of discovery had become too great, and rushing the operation would transform a calculated gamble into a suicide mission. The Rangers spent another full day lying motionless in the sugarcane fields, unable to move, unable to eat anything that required chewing, forbidden from even swatting the mosquitoes that feasted on their exposed skin. Dehydration became a serious concern as the tropical sun beat down mercilessly. On the 31st of January, as the sun began its descent, the operation entered its final phase. Captain Pajota's guerrillas moved into position at the Kabu Bridge, where the road crossed a small river. They carried Browning automatic rifles, captured Japanese weapons, and a precious .50 caliber machine gun that would serve as their primary defensive tool. Pajota positioned his men in a horseshoe formation, understanding that when the shooting started, they would face the fury of an entire Japanese battalion. His orders were simple: hold the bridge for 30 minutes, no matter the cost. The Rangers divided into 4 teams, each with specific objectives. Captain Prince would lead the main assault force directly through the front gate, while Lieutenant Melville Schmidt's team hit the rear of the camp. Lieutenant O'Connell's platoon would provide covering fire and suppress the guard towers. A specialized team under Sergeant Theodore Richardson had perhaps the most critical job. They would breach the fence and guide the POWs to safety, preventing panic that could turn liberation into chaos. Every Ranger synchronized their watches, understanding that the attack would be measured in seconds, not minutes. As twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a lone P-61 Black Widow fighter aircraft appeared overhead. The pilot executed a series of aerobatic maneuvers, deliberately backfiring his engine to create loud explosions that drew every Japanese eye skyward. While the guards watched the aerial display, the Rangers began their final approach, crawling on their bellies through 600 yards of exposed terrain. The psychological pressure was suffocating. One raised head, one metallic clink, one cough could alert the enemy and doom 600 prisoners to execution. Darkness settled over Cabanatuan with a completeness that felt almost theatrical, as if nature itself understood the drama about to unfold. Sergeant Norton. Most reached the fence line first, his fingers finding purchase in the soft earth as he positioned himself barely 20 yards from a guard tower, where a Japanese sentry stood silhouetted against the camp's interior lights. Most could hear the guard humming something melodic, perhaps a song from home, completely unaware that death crouched in the shadows below. The irony was not lost on the sergeant. In another life, that enemy soldier might have been someone most could share a drink with, discuss families with, laugh with. War had transformed them into predators and prey, and tonight the roles had been assigned. At 1900 hours precisely, Captain Prince raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. The signal rippled through the Rangers' positions like an electric current. What happened next would be analyzed in military academies for decades. A perfectly orchestrated symphony of violence that compressed hours of conventional battle into 30 minutes of surgical devastation. The first shots came from Lieutenant O'Connell's position, concentrated rifle fire that swept the guard towers with such accuracy that the sentries died before they could sound an alarm. The tower lights exploded in showers of glass and sparks, plunging sections of the camp into darkness. Staff Sergeant James Herrick led his squad through the main gate, which the Rangers had expected to blast open with explosives. Instead, they found it unlocked, a small detail that would later spark debate about whether some Japanese guards had deliberately left it accessible, perhaps retaining some shred of humanity despite their brutal orders. Herrick's squad moved through the gate in a tactical formation perfected through countless training exercises, each man covering specific angles, weapons sweeping for targets. The first Japanese soldiers they encountered were headquarters personnel, officers who had grown comfortable behind desks, unprepared for the shock of close-quarters combat. They died reaching for weapons they would never fire. Inside the prisoner barracks, Colonel James Duckworth heard the gunfire and initially believed the Japanese had begun the mass execution. He and other senior POWs had discussed this possibility endlessly during the previous weeks, planning a futile resistance with sharpened sticks and rocks. When the barracks door burst open and an American Ranger stood silhouetted in the entrance, Duckworth thought he was hallucinating from malnutrition. The Ranger's words cut through the confusion. "We're here to take you home." Some prisoners wept, others stood frozen in disbelief, while a few immediately began organizing their fellow captives for evacuation, despite having barely enough strength to stand. Outside the wire, Captain Pajota's guerrillas heard the eruption of gunfire from the camp and knew their ordeal was beginning. Within minutes, Japanese trucks appeared on the road from Cabanatuan City, headlights bouncing as they accelerated toward the bridge. Pajota had positioned his .50 caliber machine gun with mathematical precision, understanding that his first burst would need to disable the lead vehicle and create a roadblock. When the convoy reached the kill zone, the guerrilla machine gunner opened fire, his tracers drawing lines of red death through the darkness. The lead truck's engine exploded, the vehicle slewing sideways to block the road. Japanese soldiers poured from the other trucks, immediately coming under withering fire from the guerrilla positions. The battle at Kabu Bridge evolved into a desperate holding action. Japanese forces, realizing that something catastrophic was happening at the prison camp, attacked with suicidal intensity. They charged the guerrilla positions in waves, using tactics that relied on overwhelming numerical superiority and the assumption that defenders would break under sustained pressure. But Pajota's men were fighting for their homeland, for years of occupation and brutality, and they held their positions with a ferocity that shocked the Japanese commanders. Every time enemy soldiers attempted to flank the bridge, Filipino fighters engaged them in close combat, buying minutes with their lives. Back at the camp, the Rangers executed the most dangerous phase of their operation, extracting 600 sick and emaciated prisoners through hostile territory. Many POWs could barely walk, their bodies ravaged by years of starvation, disease, and torture. Sergeant Richardson's team had anticipated this problem, and they quickly organized litter teams using bamboo poles and blankets to carry those who could not move under their own power. The Rangers, already carrying heavy combat loads, now bore the additional weight of human lives, but none hesitated. Private First Class Alfonso Guadarrama found himself supporting a skeleton of a man who whispered that he had survived the Bataan Death March, had watched his friends die one by one, and had long ago given up hope of rescue. Guadarrama looked at him and said simply, "You survived for this moment." The 30th minute of the assault arrived with the mechanical precision of a Swiss watch, yet the battlefield had become a swirling chaos that defied neat timelines. Lieutenant Melville Schmidt's rear assault team encountered heavier resistance than intelligence had predicted. A reinforced bunker housing approximately 30 Japanese soldiers who had prepared defensive positions expecting exactly this kind of attack. Schmidt made a split-second tactical decision that exemplified the Rangers' training and initiative. Instead of engaging in a prolonged firefight that would alert additional enemy forces, he directed 2 of his men to maneuver, while the rest maintained suppressing fire. Private Franklin Fox and Corporal Thomas Rounceville circled the bunker's blind side, carrying satchel charges packed with enough explosive power to collapse the structure. Fox later recalled in interviews conducted by military historians that the approach to that bunker felt like moving through molasses, each step taking an eternity, while bullets snapped past close enough to feel their heat. When they reached throwing distance, both Rangers hurled their charges simultaneously, then dove for cover behind a water cistern. The dual explosion compressed the air itself, creating a vacuum that momentarily silenced all other sounds on the battlefield. When the smoke cleared, the bunker had ceased to exist as a functional structure, and the Japanese defenders inside had been eliminated as a threat. This single action prevented a potential breakthrough that could have compromised the entire prisoner evacuation corridor. Colonel Duckworth, despite weighing barely 100 pounds after 3 years of captivity, assumed command of organizing the prisoner evacuation with the same authority he had wielded before capture. He divided the POWs into groups based on their physical condition, ensuring that Rangers could efficiently distribute their limited carrying capacity. Some prisoners, delirious from sudden hope and residual trauma, attempted to return to their barracks to retrieve personal items, diaries, photographs, small treasures that had sustained them through years of hell. Duckworth had to physically block their path, explaining with tears streaming down his face that their lives were worth infinitely more than any possession. Time was measured in heartbeats, and every second spent in the camp increased the probability of disaster. The Rangers had designated specific rally points along the escape route, each manned by scouts who would guide groups of prisoners through the darkness. This content is referenced from detailed mission analysis published in military journals during the 1950s and verified through declassified after-action reports. The route crossed rice paddies, forded shallow streams, and navigated through dense vegetation that concealed numerous hazards. Ranger medic James Fisher moved constantly along the column, treating prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion or whose wounds from years of abuse suddenly reopened under the stress of movement. He administered morphine sparingly, knowing his limited supply had to last for potentially hours of evacuation. One prisoner, a Navy pilot shot down over Luzon in 1942, died in Fisher's arms from heart failure brought on by the shock of liberation combined with severe malnutrition. Fisher had to leave the body behind, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At the Kabu Bridge, the guerrilla defensive position had become a killing ground of almost incomprehensible intensity. Japanese forces, now fully aware that the prison raid was underway, committed everything they had to breaking through Pahota's line. They brought up knee mortars, lightweight but effective weapons that began dropping shells into the guerrilla positions with increasing accuracy. Captain Pahota, bleeding from shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and leg, directed fire with a calmness that steadied his men even as the tactical situation deteriorated. The .50 caliber machine gun had consumed over half its ammunition, the barrel glowing red-hot from sustained firing. The gunner, a young Filipino fighter named Rufo Vaquilar, continued firing in controlled bursts, understanding that mechanical failure of this weapon would likely result in the entire defensive line collapsing. Japanese commanders, recognizing that they faced a smaller force, attempted to flank the bridge position by sending troops through the river itself. This decision proved catastrophic. Pajota had positioned sharpshooters specifically to cover the water approach, and they engaged the waiting Japanese soldiers with devastating effectiveness. Bodies began accumulating in the river, creating a grotesque dam that actually impeded subsequent crossing attempts. The water ran red in the moonlight, a scene so horrific that even hardened guerrilla veterans would later struggle to describe it, without their voices breaking. Back at the prison camp, the final phase of the operation approached completion. Captain Prince conducted a systematic sweep through every building, ensuring no prisoners remained behind, and that no Japanese soldiers were hiding to ambush the withdrawal. In one barracks, he found 3 POWs too sick to move, dying from diseases that had ravaged their bodies beyond recovery. They begged not to be left behind, terrified that the Japanese would discover them and exact vengeance. Prince made another impossible decision. He detailed 2 Rangers to carry these men despite medical certainty that they would not survive the journey. The Rangers would leave no one behind, even if it meant carrying corpses to freedom. The evacuation column stretched over half a mile through the Philippine countryside, a serpentine trail of liberation moving through enemy-controlled territory with a desperation that transcended military protocol. Sergeant Theodore Richardson, coordinating the rear guard, watched as Rangers who had trained to be the Army's elite warriors transformed into gentle caregivers, supporting emaciated men who sobbed with each painful step. Private Edwin Rose carried a former Army captain named Charles Patterson, a man who had once commanded hundreds of soldiers, but now weighed less than 90 pounds and could not remember his own daughter's name. Rose spoke to Patterson continuously during that march, telling him stories about baseball games back home, describing American cities Patterson had never visited, painting verbal pictures of a world beyond barbed wire and brutality. Whether Patterson understood or not was irrelevant. Rose needed Patterson to know that he mattered, that his suffering had not been forgotten. The Japanese forces, realizing the full scope of what was transpiring, made increasingly desperate attempts to cut off the American escape route. Small patrol units scattered throughout the region received orders to converge on the general area and engage any American forces they encountered. This led to a series of scattered firefights along the evacuation corridor, brief but intense engagements where Rangers had to protect prisoners who could not defend themselves. Lieutenant William O'Connell's platoon fought a particularly vicious encounter near a small barrio where 15 Japanese soldiers had established a hasty ambush. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, but felt like hours. Tracers crisscrossing the darkness while prisoners huddled in ditches, some crying, others praying, all of them terrified that rescue would be snatched away at the last moment. O'Connell's tactical handling of that ambush demonstrated why the Rangers had been selected for this mission. Rather than engaging in a prolonged firefight that would pin down the column, he ordered 2 squads to provide suppressing fire, while a third executed a flanking maneuver. The maneuver squad, led by Staff Sergeant August Stern, circled through a coconut grove and struck the Japanese position from the side, eliminating the threat within minutes. Stern himself killed 3 enemy soldiers in close combat, his Thompson submachine gun firing short, controlled bursts that spoke to countless hours of training. When the firing stopped, Stern helped a former POW named Robert Body to his feet, brushed dirt from the man's ragged clothing and said, "We're going to get you home, sir." Body, who had been a colonel before capture, simply nodded, too overcome with emotion to speak. At the Kabu Bridge, Captain Pahoda received word through a runner that the prisoners had cleared the danger zone and were moving toward the planned rendezvous point with additional Filipino support units. This was the signal Pahoda had been waiting for. His men had fulfilled their mission and could begin their own withdrawal. However, extracting from an active defensive position while under sustained enemy pressure required careful orchestration. Pahoda organized his guerrillas into leapfrogging elements, one group maintaining fire while another fell back, then reversing the roles. The .50 caliber machine gun had to be extracted last, as it remained the anchor of their defensive fire. Rufo Vaquilar, the gunner, fired until the barrel began to warp from heat, then finally dismantled the weapon with hands so burned that skin peeled away from his palms. The withdrawal from the bridge transformed into a running battle through the darkness. Japanese forces, enraged by their losses and the humiliation of being held off by what they now realized was a vastly inferior force, pursued with vengeful intensity. Pahoda's guerrillas used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, leading Japanese units into pre-scouted ambush points where additional guerrilla forces waited. This created a series of cascading delays that gave the main column additional time to increase their distance from the pursuit. The guerrillas paid for this time with their blood. 14 Filipino fighters died during the withdrawal, men whose names would later be inscribed on memorials, but who would never receive the international recognition granted to the American Rangers. By dawn on the 1st of February, the combined force of Rangers, guerrillas, and liberated prisoners reached the temporary sanctuary of Filipino-controlled territory. They had traveled approximately 15 miles through enemy territory in one night, carrying 600 prisoners, many of whom had been on the verge of death. The achievement defied medical and military logic. Army doctors who later examined the POWs expressed astonishment that men in such condition had survived the journey, attributing it to a combination of adrenaline, hope, and the sheer determination of both rescuers and rescued. Captain Robert Prince, conducting a hasty headcount, confirmed that they had lost only 2 prisoners during the evacuation, both men who had died from conditions that predated the raid. Not a single Ranger had been killed in action, a statistical improbability that would later generate controversy and skepticism until confirmed through multiple sources. The liberated prisoners received their first American-provided meal in years, K rations that many initially could not digest due to their body's adaptation to starvation conditions. Medics had to carefully ration food quantities, explaining to desperate men that eating too much too quickly could trigger refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition. Some prisoners wept as they held cans of fruit cocktail, not eating but simply staring at the contents as if they were precious gems. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci moved through the groups, shaking hands, listening to stories, bearing witness to suffering that would later give him nightmares for decades. The 2nd of February brought morning light that illuminated the true scope of what had been accomplished and what had been lost. Captain Juan Pajota submitted his casualty report to Lieutenant Colonel Mucci, his face a mask of exhaustion that could not quite conceal the grief underneath. 21 Filipino guerrillas had died during the mission, men who had fought for years in the resistance, who had sacrificed everything for a moment that many thought would never come. Pajota read their names aloud in a ceremony that lasted only minutes, but would echo through the memories of all present. Eduardo Santos, Vicente Cruz, Rufo Vaquilar, who had died during the withdrawal despite his heroic defense of the bridge, and 18 others whose families would receive only the cold comfort that their sons, brothers, and fathers had died as heroes. The Rangers conducted their own after-action assessment, a clinical process that translated chaos into statistics and lessons learned. They had fired approximately 26,000 rounds of ammunition during a 30-minute engagement, an extraordinary expenditure that reflected the intensity of the fighting. Grenades had been thrown by the dozens, with some Rangers reporting they had emptied their entire loads. The precision of the assault could be measured in the enemy casualties, approximately 523 Japanese soldiers confirmed killed, with potentially more wounded who had withdrawn before being counted. These numbers, verified through post-war analysis of Japanese military records recovered during the occupation of Japan, demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated small unit tactics when executed by elite forces. The liberated prisoners represented a cross-section of American military personnel who had been captured during the catastrophic defense of the Philippines in 1942. Among them were survivors of the Bataan Death March, that horrific forced march where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners had died from execution, exhaustion, and disease. There were pilots shot down during the early weeks of the Pacific War, Navy personnel from ships sunk in the desperate battles around Luzon, and Army officers who had commanded doomed defensive positions against overwhelming Japanese forces. Each man carried stories that would take years to fully tell, trauma that would never completely heal, and survivors' guilt that would plague many until their deaths. Major Robert Lapham, who had coordinated guerrilla intelligence gathering across central Luzon, arrived at the rendezvous point on the 3rd of February to personally debrief Mucci and Pajota. According to military intelligence documentation preserved in the MacArthur Memorial Archives, Lapham was particularly interested in the tactical execution of the raid, as the success of Cabanatuan would influence planning for future liberation operations. The Philippines still held numerous prisoner-of-war camps, and the Japanese had demonstrated increasing willingness to massacre prisoners as American forces approached. The lessons learned from Cabanatuan, the importance of guerrilla support, the effectiveness of diversionary tactics, the critical nature of precise timing, would be applied to subsequent operations. Lapham also brought disturbing news from other sectors of the Philippine front. Japanese forces, aware that they were losing the war, had become increasingly brutal in their treatment of civilians suspected of supporting the resistance. Entire villages had been burned, their populations massacred in reprisal for guerrilla activities. The successful raid on Cabanatuan, while a tremendous victory, had also painted a target on every Filipino community in the region. Japanese commanders viewed collaboration with Americans as the ultimate betrayal, and they were determined to exact vengeance. This reality weighed heavily on Pajota, who understood that the people he had fought to protect might now face intensified persecution. The evacuation of the prisoners continued over several days, with the weakest men being carried to field hospitals established by advancing American units. Medical personnel worked around the clock to stabilize men whose bodies had been systematically destroyed by years of abuse. Diseases ranging from beriberi to dysentery, from malaria to tuberculosis, ravaged the former prisoners. Some would die in the days following liberation, their bodies simply too damaged to recover even with modern medical intervention. These delayed casualties were not included in the official mission statistics, but they represented real costs of Japanese brutality and the limits of rescue, no matter how heroically executed. As news of the raid spread through military channels and eventually to the press, the operation began to take on mythological proportions. Newspaper headlines in the United States proclaimed it the greatest rescue operation in American military history, a David versus Goliath story that provided a desperately needed morale boost to a war-weary public. Time magazine devoted a cover story to the raid, though many details remained classified for security reasons. The Rangers themselves, bound by military protocol and personal modesty, deflected attention from their individual heroics, insisting that the success belonged to everyone involved: the guerrillas, the Alamo scouts who had provided reconnaissance, the Air Force pilots who had conducted diversionary maneuvers, and the prisoners themselves who had maintained hope through years of horror. The strategic implications of the Cabanatuan raid extended far beyond the liberation of 600 prisoners. Japanese military planners, analyzing the operation through captured documents and interrogation of survivors, realized that their rear areas were far more vulnerable than they had assumed. Small, highly trained American units could penetrate deep into occupied territory, strike with devastating effectiveness, and withdraw before significant counterattacks could be organized. This realization forced the Japanese to divert troops from frontline positions to garrison duty, weakening their defensive capabilities across the entire Philippine archipelago. General Douglas MacArthur, studying the after-action reports, saw validation of his strategic vision, that combined conventional and unconventional operations could accelerate the liberation of the Philippines while minimizing American casualties. The individual Rangers who had executed the mission returned to their unit, where they were expected to continue operating as if the raid had been just another assignment. This expectation proved psychologically challenging for many. Staff Sergeant Norton. Most found himself struggling with recurring nightmares where he arrived at the prison camp to find all the prisoners dead, massacred because his team had been seconds too slow. Captain Robert Prince, who would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership, deflected all praise, insisting that the plan's success depended on factors largely outside his control: the guerrillas' performance, the prisoners' resilience, and a degree of luck that defied probability. In letters home that would later be preserved by his family, Prince wrote that he felt like a fraud accepting recognition for what had essentially been a collective achievement involving hundreds of people. The liberated prisoners faced their own challenges, reintegrating into a world that had continued without them for 3 years. Many returned to find that wives had remarried after being informed they were missing and presumed dead. Children had grown up without fathers, and some did not recognize the skeletal strangers claiming to be their parents. The physical rehabilitation took months, but the psychological wounds proved more resistant to treatment. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet formally recognized as a diagnosis in 1945, manifested in countless ways. Some former prisoners could not sleep in enclosed spaces, having been confined in barracks that became ovens during tropical days. Others experienced survivor's guilt, haunted by the faces of men who had died just days or weeks before liberation. Captain Juan Pajoda and his guerrilla fighters received far less recognition than their American counterparts, a disparity that reflected the racial and political dynamics of